Donald Trump has upended the world order, and it's not clear what will take its place. In the inaugural Vantage Point essay from Australia Institute Press, Dr Emma Shortis examines the future of our alliance with the United States, which all too often makes us less safe and not more. You can order your copy of After America, Australia in the New World Order now, or you can become a foundation subscriber to Vantage Point and save 25% on an annual subscription. Find it at australiainstitute.org.au/store or via the link in the show notes.
After America is made on the lands of the Kure-Wurrung, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. We acknowledge that they and their ancestors have cared for the lands, rivers and sea, and all living creatures for thousands of generations. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
We are in a battle for the soul of America.
This is a fraud on the American public.
Hi, I'm Emma Shortis, and this is After America. It's a special episode this week, our 50th. We started this show during one of the most consequential American presidential elections in recent history. It was, as Joe Biden liked to say, an inflection point.
And it's no more true or real than we think about the events of January 6th. We are in a battle for the soul of America.
Trump and his backers won that battle decisively. But America, as today's special guest writes, has forever been at war with itself. Donald Trump is not an aberration. He's as much a product of American history as JFK or Barack Obama. We always wanted this show to confront the contradictions of America and what it means to us. Australian governments have generally had what our guest labels a better America bias. But we're no longer dealing with the America we thought we knew. As our recent polling suggests, many Australians already see this, and they're realising it faster than many of our leaders. The majority of Australians, for example, recognise the need for a more independent foreign policy. The idea behind After America was to try to understand, together, how to navigate a post-American world. It's not that the United States is gone, but that it is radically changing. Understanding how, and how the rest of the world is responding, really matters. As the Trump administration dismantles the world order, we have a historic opportunity to build something new, something better, in its place. That's easy to say. History is littered with opportunities like this, ones we have often failed to take. History is messy. And this week, we're so pleased to welcome back one of the best writers on the messiness of American history. Nick Bryant was our very first guest on this show, and we're so pleased to welcome him back for our 50th episode. Nick is a former BBC foreign correspondent, where he covered Washington, New York, South Asia, and Australia. He's the host of ABC Radio's Saturday Extra and the author of The Forever War, America's Unending War with Itself. Here's Nick now. Nick, thank you so much for coming back to join us on the 50th episode of After America.
Emma, it's great to be here for your Golden Jubilee, and it's always great to talk to you. And congratulations on your new book, which I urge everybody to read.
Oh, thank you, Nick. That's so lovely of you, so kind. But I wanted to start with something that we actually discussed on the first episode and see how or if your feelings have changed about it, because you wrote in your book so beautifully about the romance, really, and the power of the United States, how you were drawn to the US as a young man, fixated by the Kennedys, like so many of us, and even, how thrilling it was to follow the road to the White House. I wanted to ask you, given so much has happened since our first chat and since you wrote the book, is that pull still there for you?
Oh, Emma, as you said that, it conjured up so many memories of my first trip to the United States back in 1984. It was the first long-haul flight I'd ever done. It was the first time I'd ever gone anywhere without my parents. I was 16 years old. My grandma had died. She'd left me a little bit of money, just enough to buy a plane ticket to Los Angeles. And I arrived there, as I often say, on the eve of the Los Angeles Olympics, which ended up being the summertime of American resurgence, after the long national nightmare of Vietnam and Watergate and the Iranian hostage crisis. That was the summer when America really got its mojo back. That was the summer when Ronald Reagan came up with that slogan, "It's morning again in America," which became the ringing slogan. And he got a landslide in that year's election. And I remember the thrill and the excitement of landing in Los Angeles, this kingdom of my mind, a place that was so sort of vivid in my imagination, and the thrill of doing that. And I contrast that now, Emma, with a certain degree of trepidation. We're going to be traveling to America in a month and a half's time. And there are those slight concerns about whether we're even going to get in, whether, I mean, let's not overstate them and let's not be sort of hyperbolic about it. But, it's not uncomplicated traveling to America in this moment. We have seen these people who have been detained, and people are taking burner phones, for instance, because they're worried that immigration officials will start checking out their social media feeds and things like that and find criticisms of Donald Trump which might disqualify them from entering the country. So, yeah, it's a real contrast to the America I went to back in 1984.
Yeah, it sure is. And I mean, for what it's worth, I feel the same. I'd be really nervous, I think. And I think with good reason to go back to the States, and would be pretty reluctant to, I think, as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Emma, because my book ends actually with us leaving America. JFK was one of my gateways into the States. I write about this in the book. There was a memorial to JFK just down the road from the inner city church that I attended in Birmingham in England as a kid. And I was fascinated by, who is this handsome young man in front of this pretty flag? And he was stood in front of a gold blob, which I later realized was the presidential seal. And JFK was very much my gateway. And JFK became our point of departure when we left New York in 2021. We flew out of John F. Kennedy Airport. And I kind of noticed how none of us looked back. When I arrived in New York for the first time, I was actually transfixed by the skyline of New York. It was twilight. We were stuck in traffic on the Van Wyck Expressway on a bus, and I could see in the distance for the first time this skyline that literally looked like some godly hand had sort of sprinkled diamonds on the horizon. And it had this lure and it had this pull, it had this magnetism. But what struck me when we left was that none of us looked back. And we haven't been back since, weirdly. And that's really odd for me, because I've never spent more than sort of 6 months of my adult life out of America. It's always a place I wanted to be in, wherever I was in the world, whether it was in Britain or whether it was in South Asia, where I was a correspondent, whether it was here in Australia. And of course, I lived in America for many, many years, covering all the presidents, going back to Bill Clinton, actually, for the BBC. And I haven't been back, and that is very telling as well. It just hasn't got the magnetic pull for me that it used to be. I still love the country. I just don't feel the need to be there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I feel the same. And Nick, I mean, even having said that, I think you were more clear-eyed about Trump, the first administration, and what a second administration would mean. You were more clear-eyed than I think most commentators and most observers. But I mean, I have found that understanding Trump theoretically and what he might do, especially the second time around, and then actually watching it happen, are two quite different things. Did you think it would be this bad?
If I could just go back a little bit, because I think I got a real insight into Trump world. It was about 7 weeks after he left the White House. I was there on the inaugural platform when Joe Biden got sworn in, and Washington that day felt like a garrison town. It felt like a city that was under military occupation. 25,000 troops were on duty to stop American fighting American. And you remember Trump made that rather kind of cheap exit from the White House. He didn't stick around to shake Joe Biden's hand. He left by the back door. And many people thought that would be the end of him, that he would never return to the White House. But about 7 weeks later, I was at an APAC conference in Orlando, in Florida.
Well, thank you very much. And CPAC, do you miss me yet? Do you miss me? Our movement of proud, hard-working, and you know what this is? The hardest working people, hard-working American patriots, is just getting started. And in the end, we will win. We're not starting new parties. They kept saying, he's going to start a brand new party. We have the Republican Party. It's going to unite and be stronger than ever before. I am not starting a new party. That was fake news.
And it was like a biblical event. I mean, it was on a Sunday. He was making his first post-presidential speech. And it's tempting to describe it as his kind of political resurrection. But by that stage, it was pretty obvious that he hadn't suffered a political death, that January the 6th hadn't killed him off, that he was still viable as a politician, even though as an American president, he had literally incited an American insurrection. So I think that always gave me a sense that he still controlled the Republican Party. You know, he still had this MAGA base. Even some of the skeptics that were horrified by what happened on January the 6th were pragmatic enough to realize that he was still the figurehead of the Republican Party, their best bet at winning back the White House. So, you know, I wrote The Forever War very much with that in the forefront of my mind. And the argument, of course, was that the history that I sort of excavate and the history that I sort of chronicle in that book make sense of him. As to your question, did I expect it to be like this? Sure, there are things that weren't on my bingo card. I mean, I didn't expect him to announce a US takeover of Gaza. You know, I didn't expect him to describe the Gaza Strip as having the potential to be a Riviera of the Middle East. You know, maybe I didn't expect him to suggest that Canada should become the 51st state. But, you know, Greenland wasn't any great surprise because he's done it before. And, you know, pretty much all of what he's done, Emma, has a historical echo. You know, when he talks about the mass deportation program, he references what Eisenhower did in the 1950s. You know, when he tramples over the Constitution, you know, it reminds us of his great presidential hero, who was Andrew Jackson, founder of the Democratic Party, but, you know, a hero for Donald Trump because he was a populist, he was a demagogue, and he had very strong authoritarian tendencies. And, you know, when he talks about Liberation Day, you know, again, he's got this new historical crush on William McKinley, hasn't he? A guy that used to be called the Napoleon of protectionism.
A short time from now, we are going to be changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America, and we will restore the name of a great president, William McKinley, to Mount McKinley, where it should be and where it belongs.
So, you know, Liberation Day didn't come as a great surprise, although, you know, I was surprised about those poor penguins in those islands off Australia. Again, not on my bingo card. But a lot of what he's done hasn't come as a huge surprise.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I really want to get into the long historical threads, you know, that Trump kind of highlights. But just before we do that, I also wanted to ask you about covering Trump. You know, you spoke about seeing him in Orlando not long after January 6th, and you spent a lot of time, of course, covering not just the first Trump administration, but American politics more broadly. It does seem like the business of covering Trump has changed this second time around, you know, partly because Trump has been so much more brazen in his attacks against the media. Is that an accurate reflection, do you think? Has it changed significantly the way Trump is covered?
Yeah, I mean, obviously he's done things like, you know, when he went to Saudi Arabia last week, the wire services weren't allowed on Air Force One, which is totally new. And the White House Press Association, the White House Correspondents Association is up in arms about that. And rightly, you know, he has sort of excluded AP, Associated Press, you know, the great American wire service, the gold standard of American wire services. You know, he's excluded them because they refused to go along with him calling the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. You know, there has been this sort of upping of the attack on the media. You know, he called us enemies of the people the last time around. You know, he called us fake news the last time around. None of that comes as a great surprise, but, you know, they have changed the way that the White House pool operates, which is this tight group of journalists that operates on a kind of rota system to cover the day-to-day activities of the president. They're the people that sort of the small group that get to go into those Oval Office sprays, as we call them, when he's sat at the fireside alongside some international leader. So there have been big changes. And Emma, somebody asked me recently whether, you know, my colleagues, my former colleagues were kind of afraid and frightened. And, you know, my answer was no. I mean, journalists just don't frighten that easily. But what does worry me is their owners have become frightened and their owners have become timid. We've seen that with Paramount and what's happened at CBS and the decision of the executive producer of 60 Minutes to step down because he didn't think he could do his job because Paramount is so worried about a merger right now that the federal government and Trump could nix. And you think of Jeff Bezos, I mean, he became a kind of figurehead in some ways of the resistance in the first administration. His masthead, the Washington Post, was changed so it had that slogan, "Democracy dies in darkness." Well, even before Trump won the president, he had this sort of preemptive act of appeasement where he decided that the Post wouldn't endorse a presidential candidate, and the Post would have been expected to endorse Kamala Harris, of course. So, it's not the journalists that I'm worried about and their backbone. It's actually their owners and their backbone that I'm worried about.
Absolutely. Again, with good reason. And Nick, part of the reason that has happened is because of an already existing concentration of corporate power, that Trump didn't create. He's very good at exploiting, but he didn't create that. He didn't create an economic system where people like Bezos or Musk, have such enormous, proportions of wealth compared to the bottom 90% of Americans. And in that way, you write beautifully about how Trump is kind of the logical conclusion of decades of erosion of trust in the institutions of the state and that concentration of wealth and power. Do you think there's an appetite for really understanding where Trump came from?
I think there is, from the people who are kind of totally mystified by it and reject him as a kind of aberration. And I'm thinking, that there still is a kind of, I call it better America bias. A lot of people who hate Trump want to believe that America is better than Donald Trump. And they want to believe in a grand narrative of American history that is always on an upward trajectory, that is always about advancement and national self-improvement. And that's why so many people were shocked by the victory of 2016, because under the grand narrative of American history, America's first black president should be followed into the White House by America's first female president, Hillary Clinton. That was the historical upward arc. Yeah. And it didn't work out that way, of course. But yeah, I mean, I find there is this sort of fascination and a growing acknowledgement that history does make sense of Donald Trump. I've written 2 books now. One is the 50-year prehistory of Donald Trump, and the other one's the 250-year prehistory of Donald Trump, because it's my belief that he goes back that far, and I say this ad nauseum, but it's worth repeating. He's as much a product of American history as a JFK or a Joe Biden or a Barack Obama or a Bill Clinton. It's just the history that we don't want to talk about. It's the history that gets over mythologized. It's the history that often gets misremembered. And it's the history often that is deliberately concealed. And if you excavate that history, which is what I've tried to do in both of my books, it really makes sense of Donald Trump.
Absolutely. He, as I said before, he's kind of the logical conclusion of American history in that sense. I'm really interested, you brought up Obama. I'm sitting here drinking my coffee out of an Obama mug. In a way, Obama kind of almost relieved Americans of their history because, as you said, he was the first black president and became representative of that long forward march to progress. And then, sometime later, Kamala Harris's campaign almost sought to do the same, to relieve Americans of the history and relieve them of Trump. But of course, that failed catastrophically. How much do you think the failure of Democrats in particular, of the Democratic Party in particular, to engage with the history that led to Trump really paved the way for his return?
Oh, there's so much to unpack in that question, Emma. I mean, first of all, it's worth pointing out that Barack Obama himself did not want to attach that racial meaning to his candidacy. He did not fight, as Jesse Jackson had done, who was the previous sort of Democratic black politician who, hoped to become president and stood the best chance in that era of becoming president, although it was still a very slim chance. And mindful of Jesse Jackson's failure, Barack Obama didn't want to sort of say, I am a natural progression of the civil rights movement. I am the dream of Martin Luther King made good. I mean, indeed, the night that he actually gave his acceptance speech in Denver in 2008, by this weird historical fluke, it was the anniversary of the the I Have a Dream speech. And Barack Obama didn't even reference Martin Luther King by name that day. And if you read his memoir, he said that was very deliberate. You know, we just didn't want to kind of over-egg this moment, and we didn't want to draw that comparison. I mean, if you go back and read his famous race speech in Philadelphia, which he delivered after Jeremiah Wright, his pastor in Chicago, all the YouTube stuff had come out against him railing against America. You know, it's as much about his white background as it is as his black background. And again, he was trying to neutralize race rather than make a big thing of his race. So that was one of the problems of the Obama administration. He didn't really want to go there in making his victory this kind of moment of kind of national atonement. You know, many white liberals especially saw it like that. Many black Americans hoped he would. And indeed, one of the reasons why the Black Lives Matter campaign arose was a kind of disappointment that Obama hadn't done more on that front. And I think a lot of people made the mistake to think problem solved. You know, America finally has a black president, what Bill Clinton called America's constant curse, which is race, which has been the thing that has bedeviled and divided the country from the very outset. You know, that problem is over. But what Trump showed us was that problem was still very much alive.
I chose to run for president at this moment in history because I believe deeply that we cannot solve the challenges of our time unless we solve them together, unless we perfect our union.
Well, I've been told very recently, Anderson, that the birth certificate is missing. I've been told that it's not there and it doesn't exist. And if that's the case,
told you that?
That's a big problem. I just heard that 2 days ago from somebody.
We may not look the same and may not have come from the same place, but we all want to move in the same direction towards a better future for our children and our grandchildren.
Today, I'm very proud of myself because I've accomplished something that nobody else has been able to accomplish.
Now, I know that there's going to be a segment of people for which, no matter what we put out, this issue will not be put to rest. But I'm speaking to the vast majority of the American people, as well as to the press. We got better stuff to do. I've got better stuff to do.
Because I'm not going to suggest that most of his support was a rejection of Obama, but a lot of his support was. And, you know, Trump's victory was seen by many of the people who voted for him as a rebuttal to the Obama presidency. And it's worth bearing in mind in this context that Donald Trump came to political fame, or rose to political fame, very much as a result of the birther movement, becoming the kind of untitled leader of the birther movement, which questioned the very legitimacy of America's first black president. It was almost like voting for Trump. You can almost sort of persuade yourself that Obama had never happened.
Yeah, absolutely. The writer Fintan O'Toole describes this as the unresolved contradictions of American history, which I think is a beautiful turn of phrase.
Yeah, and of course, people have been coming up with those kind of phrases throughout. You know, Gunnar Myrdal, the American dilemma. You know, Bill Clinton, America's constant curse. The American paradox was how it was called by historians of the Revolutionary era, who kind of were trying to weigh this idea that the country had come into existence partly because of the Enlightenment and partly because of a belief in freedom and liberty and justice and those kind of things. But at the same time, the Constitution very much embedded the idea of enslavement.
Absolutely. And it's the continual failure, I think, to resolve those hypocritical contradictions that, again, as we've been discussing, explains Trump, I think, better than anything else. And so much of all really of the ruptures of American history are driven by this foundational question around race. But what we also see in the broad sweep of American history is that after those ruptures, after the Civil War, for example, the United States will engage in this attempt to kind of reinvent and revitalize itself, you know, through radical reconstruction or through the civil rights movement, for example, in the 1960s. Do you think that I don't want to ask you if history is going to repeat itself, because it doesn't. That's not how history works. But do you think it is possible that the United States, in the face of Trump, will begin that process of, reinventing and revitalizing itself again?
No, no, I don't, to be honest. I just see that, my book is called The Forever War for a reason. And the subtitle is America's Unending Conflict with Itself. And, one of the arguments of the book is that America just has this chronic problem of what I call historical overload. There are just so many historical questions that have never been settled. The biggest one, obviously, is race. And it's always worth remembering that, the price of national unity initially was slavery. Slavery was the compromise. And after the period of Reconstruction that you talked about after the Civil War, where there was this sort of 12-year period where African Americans did enjoy a menu of rights that had been unthinkable before, that came to a shuddering halt with the end of Reconstruction. And then the price of national unity was segregation. It was Jim Crow. It was a system of racial apartheid. It was letting the American South do what they'd always done, which was to subjugate African Americans, And you hoped all that would come to an end with the Civil Rights era and the great reforms of the Civil Rights era, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which demolished de jure segregation, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which for the first time, and this is remarkable, I think a lot of people don't get this, for the first time America actually had a universal suffrage. For the first time in its history. They never had that before until 1965, when African Americans in the South were finally sort of allowed to vote in meaningful numbers. And you kind of think, well, that's the moment of resolution, but it wasn't, because the moment that legislation was passed, the South were trying to find new ways to stop African Americans from voting. Nixon wins the 1968 election partly as a result of what was called the Southern strategy. This trying to benefit politically from white unease about black advance. And that became the Republican playbook throughout the late 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the early 90s, when they had a virtual lock on the White House. They only lost one election during that phase, and it was 1976 after Watergate when Jimmy Carter won. And it, significantly, it took a Southern Democrat to win. Indeed, since the Civil Rights era up until Obama, it was only Southern Democrats that could win because they were seen as kind of moderate, partly on the question of race. So, that issue never gets resolved, and a black president didn't resolve it. I think historically speaking, the most significant thing that Barack Obama did was get elected. There wasn't great racial advance during his 8 years in the White House, and that remains an unsolved problem. But there are so many unsolved problems, whether it's, how power is divided in Washington between the branches of government, how power is divided within the states, an abortion issue that we thought was settled in the early 1970s is, again, a matter of enormous contention. The rules of democracy are still being argued over. There's so much history that is yet to be resolved.
Absolutely. And it's sounds like you're not very confident that it will be, and perhaps also not confident that the Democratic Party in particular, given that history that you've spoken about, is at all capable of pulling itself together in response to Trump.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Maybe we talk about the Civil War question later. I don't see America on the sort of unstoppable path towards the Civil War. No. But my point would be that America will never be in a state of civil peace. There'll always be this kind of argument. It'll always be a continent shared by kind of warring political tribes, because division has always been the default. That's one of the big lessons of American history. Don't be surprised by the polarization we see today, because polarization has been the kind of constant, right?
Baked in. Yeah.
Now, how the Democrats respond is really interesting. And it takes you back to the era that I was talking about, really, when the Democrats were thinking about how do we get back in the political game after, Nixon created this model that the Republicans have really sort of worked well, the kind of Southern strategy. And, Bill Clinton did it in a pretty ugly way, Emma. You'll remember in 92, the New Hampshire primary, he's been hit by the allegations of infidelity, which are obviously true. He'd been hit by the draft dodging stuff. And one of the ways that he was determined to kind of inoculate himself against the charges against Mike Dukakis, who'd been the Democratic nominee 4 years earlier, that he was soft on crime, was to go back to Little Rock and oversee the execution of a guy called Ricky Ray Rector, an African-American who'd been lobotomized, didn't understand what was going on, famously asked in his final meal to actually save the pecan pie until he came back from the death chamber. And, Clinton did a lot of this stuff in 92. Sister Soldier is another famous episode. Yeah. People can Google it if they don't know. But he went after a rapper who'd sort of done some, in the aftermath of the Los Angeles riots, and Rodney King sort of suggested that African Americans should kill white people. He went after her, but that was basically a proxy attack on Jesse Jackson. And what he was doing was saying, I'm not a traditional Democrat. I'm not going to be beholden to the African American wing of my party, and here's how I'm going to show you I'm doing that. And these were very symbolic events. And they kind of made sort of concessions to Reaganism and Nixonism that took the Democratic Party into a place where it started kind of acting a little bit like the Republican Party. And that led to some policies which I think, you could draw a direct link with to the rise of Donald Trump, such as the deregulation of Wall Street, such as the decision not to adequately regulate the internet. I often say this. Bill Clinton spoke about building a bridge to the 21st century, this move from a manufacturing economy to an information economy. But if you lived in the Rust Belt, that bridge felt like a bypass, right? And you felt like an economic castaway in a globalized system that Bill Clinton was really accelerating and pushing. And in so many ways, I think, whether it was the Welfare Act or whether it was the Lewinsky scandal or the normalization of scandal in the White House, Clinton paved the way in many ways for Donald Trump.
Absolutely, Nick. I think the 1990s has a lot to answer for, and the Democratic Party in many ways has really failed to move on. I think from the 1990s, exactly as you've described, and I think much of the party and even much of the rest of the world, I think even here in Australia, still has this sense that there can be a return to that kind of quote unquote normality of the 1990s or the early 2000s, that we can wait Trump out. I've been on panels with you. I've lost count of the amount of times I've been asked, well, what's going to happen at the midterms? Surely Trump's going to be punished because of what he's doing, and, we'll be able to wait him out and kind of return to normal. Is that your experience? Are we still confronting or really failing to confront our better America bias?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I do think the Democrats will win back the House in the Republicans have got such.
You think the midterms will be be a Democratic election?
Well, I think the Democrats will win back the House. I mean, the Senate's tricky for the Democrats. They've got a really difficult map this year, partly because so many of the seats that are up for grabs are rural states, and the Democrats are just sort of being wiped out, obviously. The few that they've managed to hold on to are sort of going one by one. So that's problematic. What do the Democrats do? I guess they have to sort of challenge every orthodoxy. I mean, one of the orthodoxies is that you've got to have a centrist candidate to win, right? And that's been the lesson of history. That really has been the lesson of history. I mean, if you look at all their sort of post-war victories, whether it was JFK, who I know is kind of seen as this liberal champion, but he wasn't. He was very much a kind of pragmatic, cynical centrist who tried to marry these kind of warring tribes of his party, which at that time was split between the segregationist South. The racists were the Democrats back then, and the kind of progressive northern wing. Trying to hold that together made Kennedy a sort of pragmatic centrist. LBJ obviously pragmatic centrist, Carter pragmatic centrist, Clinton pragmatic centrist, Obama pragmatic centrist. Again, he gets mythologized as this great crusading liberal. He wasn't. He wasn't, and nor was Kamala Harris. Again, she came very much from that kind of that band in the middle of the Democratic Party. And the orthodoxy is that's how you win, because, you do need to win the Rust Belt states that, can be quite socially conservative. It really helps if you can pick up a southern state or two, as Joe Biden did. Another centrist, by the way. Or do they kind of go down the Bernie Sanders route and the kind of AOC route and go more left wing and, try and find a kind of left wing firebrand, a left wing populist who can kind of match the kind of central character energy that a figure like Trump has. So, and I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I really don't. What struck me in 2016 was often you'd see the same sort of people at a Bernie Sanders rally as a Trump rally. They're flip sides of the same coin, a rejection of the system as it was. And, I found myself arguing at one point, which if I'd argued this in the 1990s, I would have been taken away by men in white coats, that Bernie Sanders probably would have stood a better chance of winning than Hillary Clinton, because for the simple reason he would stand a really good chance of winning the 3 Rust Belt states that she lost. So I don't think the orthodoxy that somebody like Bernie Sanders cannot win is necessarily true anymore. But I don't know whether the orthodoxy is completely defunct either.
I want to go back, Nick, to this question of elections and the strength of American democracy, though, because I think it's true that in like a normal election cycle, we would assume that Trump would lose, that the Republicans would be decimated at the midterms because of his approval rating, because of economic factors, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, we are dealing with a fundamentally different beast in the second Trump administration. We've had Stephen Miller, his advisor, literally talking about suspending the Constitution.
Well, the Constitution is clear, and that, of course, is the supreme law of the land, that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in a time of invasion. So to say that's an option we're actively looking at. Look, a lot of it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not.
The fanatics behind Trump see what they've got as a generational victory that they are not going to let go of, and they don't care about the institutions of democracy or the Constitution. Are we making a mistake in assuming that democratic processes, as deeply flawed as they are already, continue? Like, is that a dangerous assumption?
I think it would be wrong to make the assumption that because Donald Trump is sort of trashing the Constitution right now and arguably acting unlawfully is going to be disqualifying and is going to be met with a kind of big voter backlash in the midterms. I think that's mistaken, right? I think a lot of Americans can cope with that kind of constitution and norm busting so long as the economy is in good shape, right? They're willing to give presidents a pass on that. And the classic sort of historical example of that is FDR, who was called an American dictator by the great H.L. Mencken, the most famous journalist of his day. A lot of people were deeply concerned that FDR was trampling over the Constitution, concentrating too much power in the presidency, the famous Supreme Court packing, where he was trying to get around an obstructionist Supreme Court by totally changing the makeup of the Supreme Court. He did a lot of stuff which really tested the bounds of the Constitution, and he also broke the unwritten rule established by George Washington that he only served 2 terms. But guess what? He kept on getting reelected. And guess what? He was seen as a presidential great. And one of the reasons why is because he saved the American economy. He lifted so many people out of poverty. He made the economy work again. And I think, there is polling that obviously, people are concerned about the authoritarianism of the Trump 2.0. But he was elected after what people saw on January the 6th. And we saw enough of his authoritarian tendencies in Trump 1.0. It's not like he's sort of suddenly really dramatically changed in Trump 2.0. It's just they've got less people who are restraining him in the White House and people like Stephen Miller who are more determined to carry out the program. So I don't necessarily think he's going to be punished for that alone. And a lot about the midterms will depend, obviously, what state the US economy is in at the time.
It will. And I mean, there's a long time to go before we even get there. But even if, the economic situation is much worse and he is punished, even if he is gone, in 4 years, as many people are still assuming, has the world already moved on? No one really sees the United States as a reliable partner anymore, if they ever did. Do you think we're already entering a world after America?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, there's a lot of talk about, we're entering this sort of post-American world. And I mean, that phrase has been around for 25 years now, of course, with the rise of the rest and, that kind of post-Berlin Wall moment when America was the unipolar power. I mean, that was pretty short-lived given the rise of China. But I kind of look at it slightly differently. I kind of talk about us returning to what I call the pre-American world. And it's the kind of how things were in the 19th century. and how things were really throughout most of American history. If you look at it in the totality of 250 years, America has always been wary, or certainly, pre-Second World War, it's always been wary of foreign entanglements, as George Washington described them. I mean, relations with Europe in the 19th century were antagonistic. That was kind of what the Monroe Doctrine was about. It was basically saying, we don't want European powers to meddle in the Americas. It was an antagonistic relationship, so there wasn't anything called a transatlantic alliance that back then. It was based on a system of protectionism. America was an expansionist power. And Donald Trump told us it was going to return to being an expansionist power in his inaugural address in January.
The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars, launching American astronauts to plant the stars and stripes on the planet Mars.
It was a line I think a lot of us missed, because it was a line that ended with him talking about planting the flag on Mars, and Elon Musk sort of erupted, and that became the headline. Wow, Musk celebrates Trump saying, let's go to Mars. But if you go back to the beginning of that sentence, Trump says, we're going to return to being an expanding nation.
It was
obviously the implication that
destiny
they want more territory. And that's what they did in the 19th century, right? They moved westward. They started getting a kind of American empire at the end of the century under McKinley, although he was a kind of accidental imperialist. I don't think Donald Trump realizes that. And it's a kind of reversion to type in many ways. America acting in its own interests and not having an alliance system and not being the center of a kind of international trading system and having antagonistic relations pretty much with everybody. So we're kind of getting towards that, I think, as much as a kind of post-American world.
Which I think you're absolutely right to identify, because that is, really the ideological project of the people who are now behind Trump in the White House, to revert to a pre-civil rights era imagined version of the United States.
Yeah, it's a 19th century mindset. And I mean, it's very telling that Trump's heroes presidentially come from the 19th century. I mean, I spoke of them earlier. Andrew Jackson, who was president in the sort of late 1820s and 1830s, and then McKinley, who, before Trump sort of raised him up as his kind of historical hero. I mean, most of us just remember McKinley for getting killed, right? I mean, he was the third American president to get shot and assassinated. And a lot of people just didn't really look at his life. They just focused on the nature of his death and who came after him, who was Teddy Roosevelt. But, that is the mindset. And it's a mindset, it's a kind of dark Enlightenment mindset. Sarah Churchwell gave this great lecture in Sydney last week about this. And it's this mindset where, it doesn't really take seriously the traditional belief in democracy. It doesn't take seriously women's rights. It's very much a manocracy. It's very much a kind of misogynistic, again, how things were in the 19th century. It's nativistic in its immigration policies. Again, that was how America was in the 19th century. So in many ways, it's a kind of reversion to type.
It is. And I think that marks the Trump administration and perhaps the immediate future of America. And Nick, you are, I think, singular in your ability to distill that history and reflect it back and help us understand what Trump is doing and the potential futures, I think, of the United States. So thank you, as always, for your insight and your generosity.
Emma, it's been my absolute pleasure. And again, congratulations. It's great that you've reached this milestone.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Nick. Thanks so much for joining us for our 50th episode. If you want to read more, you can order your copy of our inaugural Vantage Point essay. In the first edition, After America, Australia and the New World Order, I explore the future of our alliance with the United States. You can purchase the first edition or become a Foundation subscriber to the Vantage Point series via our website, australiainstitute.org.au/store, or tap the link in the show notes. We'd love to get your thoughts on the show so far. You can send us feedback, as well as episode and guest ideas, to our email address, which is podcasts@australiainstitute.org.au. This episode was recorded on Thursday, the 15th of May. some stuff will probably have changed since then. After America is supported by the Andrew Farron Foundation and produced by Angus Blackman. We'll be back next week. I'm Emma Shortis. Thanks for listening.